Okay, hello. I've been at it again. Gotten some new ideas related to Class EUI because we did a talk with Max Stoiber, Fabrice, and I, and yeah, we just shared our ideas on how we had solved different things, and we learned a few new things. Because personally, I'm not super familiar with how the different libraries solves different things. One of those things being specificity. Wasn't aware that this was a big challenge in plain CSS and JS libraries as well. So I got a couple of questions from Max, which made me start thinking. Because currently Class UI is a library that focuses on leaving your code with only CSS class names. That's like the footprint, with a tiny function there to clean up some specificity stuff. But then you create a CSS file, and you have to insert that in the head of your index file and that stuff, and you need a bubble plugin. Now, all of this stuff it makes a lot of sense, like like the concept. What's challenging about Class UI is the setup. You need a bubble plugin. You have to configure it with your build tool. It works differently in production and in development, stuff like that. And that might be okay. Like, you can't solve everything. But we learned a lot through Class UI. And with those questions from Max around the choices we made and stuff like that, I got inspired to try to take our learnings from Class UI and create a runtime CSS and JS library. What's kind of cool about this library, it's like 150 lines of code. And like the implementation took like maybe a couple of hours, but I went like back and forth on the API. That's what I spend time on. It's the API. But I thought I would just show it to you, and I'm going to ask you, if you know Class UI, does this library make more sense to you? Does it solve the things that Class UI solves? And if so, this is far easier to get up and running and integrate with your existing tools. Yes, so let's get going. Okay, so the library has a factory called create CSS. So you don't use it directly from the library, and the reason is that you can configure it, and we'll look into that configuration later. And that means you can have multiple instances of this CSS thing, and you can share the configuration across server-side rendering and client-side rendering and testing and stuff like that. Okay, so we have a tiny React app here, and we are going to create our first class. And we point to CSS, and instantly we get the type help. So let's give this a color of red. So as you can see here, we are calling the CSS property as a function, and then we pass in the value. And the reason we have this API is because it gives so much better type experience, even though you don't use TypeScript. As you can see here, when I dot into CSS, I instantly get up the possible CSS properties. And when I call it, I instantly get an indication of what value I can pass in here. And it's super, super smooth compared to having the object syntax. And this is a huge problem in current CSS and JS solutions. You don't get a really good type experience because the object typing experience in itself is not really optimal, because you get a ton of other fluff in there. You don't only get, like you see here, I only get explicitly what I've told it to be. Well, if I were to create like an object, I would get tons of other stuff in there. Yes, and I'll talk more about that as we move on. Okay, so I've added this one now. So how would I add multiple styles to this element? Well, then I would use the compose function. So we'll use that, compose, and then we'll give it like a background color of gray. That's a nice color. So you use the compose to basically compose together different properties. And this is what we call like atomic, what should we call it? Atomic properties. Because for each of these two properties, there's a class name created. So it creates a class name specifically for the color red. So wherever else in your code, no matter where the composition occurs, it will not inject that rule, but it will reuse the class name. And the same goes for the background color. So this is really interesting because typically CSS and JS solutions, they create class names based on the composition on the element. So they kind of like go through the properties on the element, and then they create a CSS specific for that, specifically for that element. But we don't do that here. We create specific class names for each property, and most properties are reused across the project. So to begin with, it will inject a lot of rules, but then suddenly it stops injecting because you're basically just reusing everything. And this is the really important part to solve specificity as well. So we can, maybe I can mention that quickly now. So the problem with specificity is that the order of the class names doesn't matter. What matters is the ordering in the CSS, like in the style tag, the CSS definition. And with a solution like this, or any solution really, you can't control that. It's just impossible to control it, like the ordering of the CSS. It will be extremely tedious. So the way this is solved, and this is what we learned in classy UI, is that with this compose thing, we can do, let's do another background color of yellow. Now, of course, the gray background color was injected before the yellow, so the yellow will kind of like have the correct ordering. But that is not necessarily the case, because you might have different compositions messing up the ordering of stuff. So we want to ensure that the last background color is the active one. And this is exactly what compose does. Since we're creating a class name per property with its value, it's able to figure out that, okay, in this composition, we have two background colors, and we'll just remove the class name. In this case, this one, it will just remove it because we already have a background color that comes after it. And that is how we solve specificity. Cool. But now we're just exposed to a different way of building up our CSS. So like, what can we do with this? So the first thing we're going to look at is we should look at tokens. So classy UI introduced like tokens. So you were like, it was a token-based approach inspired by Tailwind CSS. And that is a very, very good concept. In classy UI, you are kind of at the mercy of the configuration. Like we have this big configuration that you get out of the box. And that might be exactly what you want. This is kind of like what I want feedback on. But in this library, as you saw, you are kind of like open to use whatever you want here. But then you can gradually go into a token-based approach. And the way this works is that basically you just give it a tokens, and for example, colors, and we say that red is color tomato, and instantly you can see that I'm getting type errors here, and that is because the colors is mapped to things like color, background color, border color, and stuff like that. So now I can't use these values anymore. Like I can use them, but in terms of typing, I've said that I'm going to use a token-based approach. So if we go back to color now, you can see that I have red here, and that's the only one. So let's do green. Isn't there one called lime? And then yellow, and we'll do like an orange, I don't know, something like that. Green and yellow. Oops, yellow. Okay, so now I've gotten into a token-based approach. And again, I can still override this with specific values, but it will use the token when it gets a match on that. And this could be like primary and secondary and whatever you want in. And the tokens are based on theme UI. So we also have space here where we can say that 0 is 1 rem, 2 rem, 3 rem. And then we can, for example, add the margin here, margin top of 0. Again, you see instantly in the suggestion here what values I can actually pass in here. Wait, we should do like 2. Yeah, and you see it jumps down. Okay, one thing you might have noticed is that when I type margin here, we actually don't have the margin CSS property. And this is actually something we also learned in classy UI, that these properties of padding and margin, which kind of collects, it kind of like is an abstraction over other properties. So margin would be an abstraction over margin left, margin right, margin top, and margin bottom. It ruins specificity. I totally see it from a developer experience why you want to have it there, but it actually causes a huge problem with specificity. So we can't really have that, or can we? Because another thing we expose in this configuration is something we call utils. So instead of introducing like margin, we can introduce something new like margin X, for example. And the way this works is that it gets the CSS instance, and then you can define whatever arguments you want to take in. So we want to take in actually the spacing here. So what we can do is move the tokens up here, and then we say key of type of token space. And then we also want to allow passing in the pseudo. Yeah, I haven't talked about that yet. Okay, I'll just add it for now, and then I should have shown that first. But what we do here, we compose, and then we compose margin left with the value, possibly the pseudo, margin right, value, and possibly the pseudo. Okay, so now we have margin X. And now we can look, we have margin X, and we can pass in again 2, for example. Yes. So this is a way for you to kind of like create your own API for dealing with the styling in your application based on the tokens and everything. Now, so the question is, what is this pseudo thing? I completely forgot to mention that now we're creating like properties, but we also have these pseudo selectors. And as I mentioned, each of these properties are contained within a class name, which means that we actually have to define the pseudo selectors for each of these properties. So for example, if I want the yellow to appear on hover, I can pass in a second argument. And that is the pseudo selectors. Let's see. Oh, it should be on something broke here. Is it my cursor? I believe it thinks I'm on touch or something. Why does it think that? Let's see what we can do about it. Oh yeah, weird. When I'm in full screen, it thinks I'm on touch. Anyways, no, there it works. Weird. Anyways, as you can see, the pseudo selectors is a simple string. Like in classy UI, we have the pseudo selectors as like a dotted thing after you choose the token. And these pseudo selectors are super complicated. I have realized, like, sometimes you want one of them, sometimes you want like hover and then something else on disabled, sometimes you want it to be on hover and disabled. Sometimes you want it to be hover and disabled, but not when it's active, for example. It's a language in itself, these pseudo selectors. So we're not typing or doing anything about that. I don't think that makes any sense. So yeah, you just write the pseudo selectors like this. And then there's a question about, what about media queries? How do we solve that? So we have another property here called screens, where I, for example, can say tablet. And also here we get some CSS, though it's a string. And what we give back here is basically just a media query. Let's say 700 pixels, media query string, and then we'll insert the CSS. The CSS string. Okay, so when I save this now, we suddenly have a tablet, and this tablet actually appears on, maybe we should reduce let's remove the background colors there. And then when we look at this, we find tablet. Now this is a property. So when I dot further now, I get all the properties, but they will only activate on tablet. So let's change the background color and let's give it a green one. Okay, so we're on tablet now, but now we're below tablet. We're on tablet, we're below tablet, and we're on tablet again. And again, I can set like a hover on this, so it only there on tablet or nothing there. So this is what I was going back and forth on, because with the object notation syntax, it's possible to kind of group screens and pseudo selectors together, so you can like define multiple properties per pseudo selector and screen. But that doesn't reflect the atomic mindset here, that every single piece of line here produces a specific CSS name. And if you're using the exact same syntax somewhere else, it won't inject a new rule. It does nothing. It just returns the class name. Yes. Cool. What else do we have here? Yes, let's have a look at server-side rendering. So currently I'm creating like a normal CSS factory, but I can also create, let's see if we'll get it here, create SSR CSS. So you can imagine that you're running this on the server, or like the power of injecting at runtime is especially useful related to server-side rendering, but also asynchronous loading of code, so that you don't have to figure out what CSS should I load when I load this piece of code, because the CSS is injected as you use it. So it kind of like eliminates that problem. And the same is for server-side rendering. So if we change this now into create SSR CSS, let's see, and let's save that. And I believe, yes, we are without any CSS now, because now it doesn't inject it to the document. What you rather get is what we can see down here. I've cheated a little bit. We are getting get styles. Let's see, let's try this again. Oh, didn't I implement this? Just give me 2 seconds. I forgot to refactor this. Okay, and we are back. Sorry, I changed the API again and I forgot to fix this part. Now, so what happens now is that it doesn't inject the styles into the document. It rather collects them. And then you can call this CSS get styles, and then it just gives you the styling that was collected for that render. And this is the really interesting thing, because you can, with, for example, React, you can create an instance of create SSR CSS, and then you can pass that on a provider, for example, into the rendered app, and then you use it. And then whenever you're done rendering, you just go get the styles and you include those styles in the payload, like the HTML payload. And then, of course, it runs as normal on the client side again. But yeah, so on its own, it's not like React specific or anything. It only has like create CSS and create SSR CSS. And then you can either provide it like using a provider, or you can use it directly depending on the scenario. Yes. But I believe this is actually what I wanted to show you. And again, my question is, if you've tried Class UI or looked at it, how do you feel about this library? Would this rather solve it better? Like just the iteration of developing, it's a lot faster to get going. It handles async stuff, server-side rendering. Don't have to integrate with build tools or anything. So that really appeals to me. Although I certainly like the concept of classy UI as well. But I'm here to present ideas and learn stuff, and then don't be afraid to show off that, oh, maybe this should be a better approach, and so on. Yes, okay, cool. I hope I didn't forget anything. Please give me feedback, and we'll see what we'll do about this thing. Okay, bye-bye.